The first large piece we're going to look on the back row for each player are the knights, which are displayed by little horsemen. Knights have very specific movement that is unique to any other piece on the chessboard. First thing is that knights can jump over pieces. So for example, a very common opening would be something like this, followed by the knight coming out here. So the knight moves in a very specific form, sometimes called an L. So it's up, 2, over 1. And that can be done in any potential combination. So you could go up 2, over 1 to here. You can also go up 2, over 1 to here. You can also go over 2, up 1 to here. So this G1 knight has 3 legal moves at the start of the game. To go to F3, H3, or E2. So since we have 3 options, which one is best? Well, let's take a look at each of these 3 moves. If our knight was to go out and play itself to H3, we've addressed 2 of our 3 opening principles, where we have developed a piece and we have helped facilitate kingside castling by getting rid of the pieces between the rook and the king. However, what we didn't do is we haven't established the center. So now let's look at where this knight can move on the side. You can go down 2, over 1, to back to G1, its home, over 2, down 1, to F2, over 2, up 1, to F4, or up 2, over 1, to G5. And this is kind of what this scope of this knight will look like over here. Which, while it does control multiple squares, let's look at our critical squares that we looked at in the first part of this lesson. In the middle, are we controlling any of the middle squares? No, we aren't. Would we control any of the middle squares even after moving again? Well, if we move to F2, we would potentially be helping to defend E4, or if we move to G5, we'd also be defending E4, but we've taken 2 moves to try and do that, where we could have been moving other pieces or achieving other ends. So one of the first things that you can learn from this is the old saying that a knight on the rim is dim, or knight on the rim is grim, however you would like to rhyme it. And let's look at a clear board so that we can look at that further. So we've already looked at the scope of a knight, which is what squares can a knight have control over. So let's look at 2 knights. We're going to look at a white knight and we're going to look at a black knight. This white knight's going to have a nice centralized square in the middle, whereas this black knight is going to occupy a space on the rim or the edge of the board. So let's look at this. Okay, so the white knight would start normally at G1. Let's say it moves to F3, which is a very common move. And let's say it moves again to D4, which would be a follow-up move to moving it to F3. So this knight's going to be occupying D4. Let's look at all the squares that this knight controls on D4. So you can see that this knight has 8 squares that it controls, 4 of which are on their opponent's side of the board, and 4 of which are more defensive squares on their side of the board. Now let's take a look at this black knight. This black knight can control squares like G3, F4, F6, and G7, because the knight can't control squares that aren't actually on the board. So you can see that this knight controls 4 squares. I'll mark these in blue, whilst this knight controls 8 squares, which we're going to mark in red. Both knights are capable of controlling a maximum of 8 squares, but the white knight is much better placed than the black knight because it can control the maximum amount of squares that is legal. Now, each piece on the chessboard has individual pros and individual cons. The pro of the knight is that for one piece, it has control over both colors of the board. For example, when we look at the bishops, we're going to know that the bishops control diagonally one specific color of the board, which is great if the game is oriented around dark square related issues, weaknesses, or whatever. But there's nothing stopping a well thought out strategy from trying to occupy the light squares. For example, you could have pieces on all of these squares that I'm highlighting in green, and this bishop is not going to be able to do a thing about it, as its home is on a dark square and it will only be able to influence dark squares. Whereas the knight, if you look at the matrix that it makes, you're going to see whatever color the knight is on, it will be guarding squares of the opposite color. So you can see that the knight's on a dark square, it's controlling light squares, like that. If the knight were to move, it would be sitting on a light square, and it would be controlling dark squares. So in the instance of what you need a knight to defend or attack, depending on how you place it, that knight can either have control over light squares or dark squares, depending on the need. That's something that a bishop cannot do. And a knight and a bishop are considered dynamically equal when we look at position evaluation, which will come a little bit later on in the lesson. So a major pro of the knight is that it can control both colors, but only one at a time. So this knight definitely is controlling these dark squares very nicely, but it's not controlling any of these light squares. But we would have to take some time to reposition this knight to here, which means that we would pretty much have to move here, here, down, over, and then back up to get it into a dark square to be able to control those light squares. And that takes time. And time, at least for the purpose of the knight, is a con, because the knight is very slow. If we have a knight on this side of the board, I'll take some of these pieces off, and we want the knight to go from this end of the board to this end of the board, it's going to take it a very long time. 1 move, 2 moves, 3 moves, 4, 5, 6 moves to get from one corner of the board to the other. Whereas its dynamic counterpart, the bishop, can literally move from this h8 square, or h1, to a8 in one fell swoop. So a con of the knight, while it can cover both squares, which is a pro, it does it very slowly, which is a con, especially when you need to be somewhere right now. The bishop can facilitate that much better than the knight. The quality of knight can also be determined by effective squares where a knight can go to and what sort of influence it can have on the game. And pawn structures can play a key role into determining the effectiveness of all pieces, but especially pieces like our knights and our bishops. So since the knight moves slow, we want to keep it in the center because it's much quicker to get from the center to the edge than to go from the edge all the way to another edge. So we want our knights to be centralized. We also want our knights to have good outposts. For example, in this position, this knight on f3 looks relatively dire, as, while it's centralized and it's in a good square, what are its prospects? Right, so let's take a look at where the knight can go by looking at its scope. Like so. So one of the issues is we're not going to be able to move our knight forward. We can't even move it up to here. We'd have to try and move it back, and then even if we move it back and we try and move it over and up, there's really no easy way that this knight's going to get past this huge pawn blockade. So this is a very sad knight. Now, if the knight were for some reason able to get past this blockade and end up in a square like g6 right here, or let's take this light squared bishop off and put the knight on e6, this knight is a fantastic knight, where it's not caught behind its own pieces. It cannot be attacked by things like pawns or things that are of less value. This knight is extremely active in this particular position, and according to relative worth, I would much rather take this particular knight, which is extremely well placed and very very hard to displace, over, for example, this rook right here, which is worth more in theory than this knight, but this rook is just standing in the corner doing absolutely nothing, whereas this knight is being a relative monster in this position with its attack on the queen. We have a potential tactical square right here on c7. This knight is doing a ton, while this rook is doing absolutely nothing. Even though the rook is worth more points than the knight when it comes to positional evaluation, this knight is much, much better and is a very good knight. Whereas our last position, having the knight on f3, this knight is, well, it's certainly centrally placed. It doesn't really have a good future because, well, what's it supposed to do? There's really nothing for it to do. In this way, knights thrive in what we call closed positions. While this position with the pawn structure I have is not a realistic one you're going to see in games, it's certainly a illustrative example of a closed position. You're going to see that the pawns are interlocking with each other. There's no easy way for the pawns to break through or for there to be any capture of pawns, with the exception of possibly using a piece to take out a couple of pawns, which we'll talk about in more detail later. But as far as pawn versus pawn combat, there's really no way for this position to open up. So in that position, the knight is going to be superior to, for example, this bishop, because at least the knight has the opportunity to, in one way or another, try and jump over some of these blockades or barricades, and to try and put itself in a more active position where the bishop is going to be permanently stuck behind this Maginot line, if you will, of opposing pawns, and this bishop will never have a good day, as much as it wants to.